Chapter 430 Your Choice. 1. Inside of a small room. With his head lowered, Octavius studied Aaron's dissected body. Next to him was a man with neatly combed black hair and squared glasses. He was currently wearing a white lab coat with blue gloves in each hand. Beep. Beep. In his hand was a small transmitter that repeatedly beeped throughout the room. The man was called Conrad Johnson, and he was the one assigned with the task of finding traces of 876. The wanted fugitive that the Union and the Monolith had agreed on hunting down together. The first time he saw traces were a few matches back in the tournament. Before he could get a proper read on them, the signal quickly disappeared. Then after that he was able to find traces once again, and as he had reacted quickly he was able to find where the traces came from, but when he did he was left with more questions than answers. You're saying that the transmitter the Monolith gave us is indicating that 876 is none other than Aaron? Octavius asked as his deep and emotionless voice rang throughout the whole room. Yes, it appears to be so. Conrad nodded his head in a helpless manner before placing the transmitter next to Aaron's head. Beep. 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 The moment the transmitter touched his head, the transmitter started to beep even more loudly. With a complicated look on his face, Conrad took out a small tube that was about the size of a finger. Then taking a small sample of his blood he put it in the tube and shook it. This process only lasted for a couple of seconds before he stopped. Once he stopped he turned to look at the tube, and when he did he shook his head. His blood is also contaminated just like the Monolith said. Doubt started to creep inside of Conrad's head as he softly and carefully asked. It's him, isn't it? 876 is Aaron. But contrary to his expectations, Octavius shook his head. It's not him. Not him. Conrad replied with a confused look on his face. Be it the tracking device and blood test, all evidence pointed that he was indeed 876, so he really couldn't understand. Without sparing him a glance, Octavius continued. Aaron's whereabouts during the time 876 was in the Monolith can easily be found. It is impossible for him to be 876. Before the tournament started, Octavius paid close attention to all the promising contestants, and so he naturally knew that it was impossible for Aaron to be 876. Once his thoughts paused there with a frown on his face, Octavius suddenly thought of something. Placing his hand over Aaron's face, he suddenly squeezed it. The sound of bones breaking resounded throughout the room as blood spurted all over the room. Conrad, who had been watching the whole time, opened his eyes in shock as he couldn't quite make out the situation. Before he could say anything, Octavius retrieved his hand back. It was then that Conrad suddenly noticed it. A small device that was resting in the middle of his finger. Supposedly this was the tracking device. Calmly analyzing it for a good minute, Octavius handed it to Conrad. Analyze it. See if there is something hidden inside of it. Why, yes. With trembling fingers, Conrad took the chip and weakly nodded his head. After that, giving Aaron one last look, Octavius left the room. Ashton City. Inside a private residence owned by the Demon Hunter Guild, two people sat in front of a sofa, staring at a holographic projection in front of them. Displayed on the projections were the images of the tournament. Of the two people seated on the sofa, one was a male while the other was a female. With blonde hair and blue eyes, the woman looked stunning. On the other hand, the male looked less impressive, however his solemn and sharp look did give off his own charm. With her left hand on the male's thigh, the woman, Samantha Dover, covered her mouth with her hand as she muttered. I'm glad we didn't let Nola see this. Yes. Ronald nodded his head. He completely agreed with her words. This was especially so after the last match where they saw a contestant being cut in half by someone. The scene was just too gruesome for someone as young as Nola to see. Pressing her hand on her cheek, Samantha wondered. I wondered when it will be Ren's turn. As she said those words, a look of anticipation flashed across her eyes. Originally, the both of them weren't very interested in the tournament, however, upon receiving an anonymous tip from someone that Ren was going to participate, they dropped everything they were doing and decided to watch the tournament together. He should be coming soon. Ronald replied briefly. Despite sounding stoic, Samantha could feel the excitement and nervousness in his voice as he anticipated his son's performance. Excitement at the prospect of seeing his son shine in the tournament, and nervousness at the dangers that lay in the tournament. Especially after having seen so many injuries and even deaths. But not even a second after he said those words, the front doorbell of their house rang. Ding. Dong. Turning to look at each other, the duo curiously turned to look in the direction of the door. Then standing up, Samantha calmly walked towards the door. Oh my. Checking the camera to see who it was, a look of shock appeared on Samantha's face not long after as she quickly headed for the door and opened it. See I Clyke. With a brilliant smile on her face, she greeted the guests. Welcome. At the same time, standing near the portal that would transmit the contestants to the platforms, Keimer had a calm look on his face. Or rather, he looked bored. He did not have any excitement about his next opponent. He was merely rank after all. He would have previously dismissed him for being human, but after witnessing Kevin's strength not too long ago, he decided to no longer look down on them as much. He acknowledged the fact that not all humans were useless. Even then, he still did not have high regard for his next opponent. After all, it was already rare enough for the humans to have someone as strong as Kevin, but to have two? Keimer did not believe in the chances. As his thoughts paused there, his line of sight met with one of the people managing the portals. Then taking a step forward, he slowly entered the portal. What's with that look? Staring at Kevin, who had just come out of the portal, my face leaned back a little as my eyes squinted. The way he came out of the portal just, well, how should I describe it? It felt as though he was trying to purposely act like a tough guy. The moment Kevin heard my words, his brows twitched a little. What are you on about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, I replied with a meaningful look. Raising his brow, Kevin glanced towards his right and left before he leaned his body forward slightly and whispered. Actually, I was trying to imitate you. Imitate me? Yeah. Kevin nodded his head repeatedly. You know, when you go all edgy and stuff, and to be honest, I think I did a very good job. Kevin's response was so out of my expectations that I was unable to reply to him properly. It was then that a victorious smirk appeared on Kevin's face as he patted me on the shoulder. I'll wait for you at the stands. If you can, try ending the match as fast as I did. Before I could say anything back, Kevin bid goodbye to me and directly left. There were a lot of things that I wanted to say to him before he left, like how he had doped himself to victory, but then again they were within the rules, so I really couldn't say anything. Unlike the tournaments at the Lock, this was not a children's tournament. Apart from the out-of-bounds rule, which was set up purposely with the intent of limiting the contestants' space, there were very few rules placed in the tournament. This was obviously done on purpose. After all, in a real fight, rules did not exist. Be it artifacts, potions, killing, or anything that would have normally been banned in tournaments held in the human domain, everything was allowed here. The referees were only there to initiate and end the match. Deaths were inevitable, and so if someone died, although it would look bad on them, it was really nothing worth mentioning. Couldn't say I was against this, to be honest. After all, only through these types of tournaments would someone truly be able to display their full power. This was no soft tournament where everyone just cuddled with each other after the end of each match. No, this was a real tournament. A tournament meant to replicate reality. Carolium, please make your way to Portal 7. Snapping me out of my thoughts was the voice of one of the people responsible for watching over the gates. Upon hearing his voice, I immediately followed his instructions and headed for the portal and entered. Swoosh. The moment I stepped out of the portal, a familiar breeze brushed past my body as I took a look at my surroundings. It was then that I suddenly felt a terrifying pressure coming from the opposite end of the arena. I didn't need to look to realize that it belonged to my opponent. Keimer. Standing tall with his back straight, wearing leather armor that covered the bottom part of his body as well as his chest, Keimer gazed into the distance with languid eyes. Subjected to his pressure, I merely frowned. Although the pressure he was releasing was strong, it wasn't anything that I wasn't used to. Surprised flashed across Keimer's eyes as his languid eyes became a little bit clearer. It was then that a referee suddenly materialized in the middle of the arena. Once the referee appeared, extending my hand, Malvol's sword appeared in my hand. Given the current circumstances, I had no choice but to use the sword, and even then, since our terrain was limited, I wasn't too worried about its short length. Placing my sword on the right side of my waist, I raised my head and stared at the referee. Once I was all set up, I nodded my head. As soon as I nodded my head, the referee turned to look at Keimer. Feeling the referee's gaze turning his eyes away from me, Keimer nodded his head. Raising his hand, the referee shouted, "Begin." Bang. Once the referee's words faded as though a grenade had exploded, A terrifying sound resounded throughout the whole arena as Keimer's body disappeared from its spot. Everything happened so fast that I had barely any time to react. Fortunately, I wasn't helpless. Eyes of Kronos. The moment I heard the loud explosion, I activated Eyes of Kronos. Following this, everything around me suddenly slowed down significantly. Shit. Once time slowed down, my face paled slightly as I was left shocked by the fact that Keimer was already only a couple of feet away from me. It had to be noted that I had activated my skills the moment I heard him leaving. For him to have moved this far, it could only mean that his speed was frightening. Fortunately, I was not helpless. With my hand by the side of my waist, I decreased the intensity at which time slowed down. Once that happened, Keimer's body started to once again move in my direction. Just as he was a couple of meters away from me, I activated my other skill. The one. Keimer's body faltered and a small opening appeared right next to his right shoulder. The opening was so small that if I didn't have Eyes of Kronos, I would have never been able to find it. Thankfully I did, and I quickly pulled out my sword. With time still flowing slowly, I watched as my sword smoothly came out from my scabbard before coming into contact with Keimer's body. Once it came into contact with his body, I deactivated all my skills. Time, which was previously flowing slowly, instantly became faster, and I suddenly felt a terrifying pressure bear down on my hand which was holding onto the sword. Spurt. Following this, green blood dyed my vision as my body skid all the way back before coming to a halt near the edge of the arena. Once my body came to a stop, raising my head, I watched as Keimer looked at me with his eyes wide open in shock. With his hand pressed onto his shoulder that was continuously leaking blood, his originally languid eyes completely changed, and so did the aura around him. The arena, which was originally loud, also became extremely quiet as I felt multiple eyes land on me. With a bitter smile on my face, I placed my hand on my face and clenched it. Guess the cat is out of the bag. No point in hiding anymore. 431 Your choice. 2. This. Looks of absolute shock flashed across the faces of Lorena and Zach as their eyes bulged wide open. Nully, what have they just witnessed? They both thought at the same time. Everything happened so fast that they were both unable to understand what had happened. In fact, moments prior they were merely commentating about the match without much enthusiasm. After all, Keimer was extremely strong. Both Lorena and Zach were unsure about their own prospects of beating him, let alone someone who was big-ranked like Karelium. But just as they thought that this was going to be an easy match, out of nowhere, they witnessed Karelium gain the upper hand over Keimer as blood seeped down from his shoulder. It had to be noted that Keimer not once had been injured throughout the tournament. Could this have been due to luck? Everyone shook their head. There was a limit to how lucky someone could be. The speed at which Karelium attacked was simply way too fast for anyone to pick up with the back die. To add further clarity that this may have not been just luck, the look on Keimer's face as soon as he realized he had been injured became perfectly vivid for all spectators present to see, as they understood that from the first exchange that this was no luck. How he did it, everyone did not know. However, hope suddenly reignited inside their hearts. Could it be possible? Wait, what is he doing? Startling everyone out of their stupor was Lorena's voice as she stood up and pointed toward the screen. It was then that everyone saw it. Karelium placing his hand over his face and slowly removing what seemed to be a mask off his face, revealing the features of a young man with jet black hair and deep blue eyes. His looks, which were fairly handsome, instantly attracted the attention of almost everyone that was watching the match. Quick, someone scan his face and get me a report on who he is. The first one to react to his sudden face reveal was Zach, who stood up and glanced in the direction of the people working in the studio. Instantly, upon hearing his voice, everyone woke up from their stupor and quickly got to work. It wasn't just them that was doing this, but so were the big guilds throughout the world, as they all wanted to find the identity of the mysterious young man that had suddenly shown up on the stage and had even managed to gain an advantage on Keimer, one of the top contenders for the top contenders of the tournament. The reporters were quick. Within just a minute of them scanning the face of the young man who had appeared on the stage, however, the moment he looked through them, his mouth opened up in shock. 1631. This. They were able to gather information about him. Without wasting any seconds, they quickly sent it to Zach, who briefly looked through them. However, the moment he looked through them, his mouth opened up in shock. This. Lifting his head and staring at the crew to make sure he wasn't seeing things wrongly, it was only after he got confirmation from them that he turned to look back at the camera. A complicated look flashed across his face as he repeatedly lowered and raised his head to make sure that the profile did indeed match the features of the man on the stage. I don't know how I should break this, but... Lowering his head and once again looking through the information, Zack scratched the back of his head and muttered. We have identified the contestant on the stage and, well, I don't know how to say this, but his name is Rindover. Zack paused. Then raising his head and staring straight into the cameras, he said. And he is supposed to be dead. At the same time this was happening on the upper echelon platform. Interest finally ignited on the faces of the people present as they gazed towards the platform where Rin and Keimer were fighting. This was especially so for Brutus and Gervis, who leaned their bodies forward, seemingly trying to get a better look at the match. The Elven Queen, on the other hand, although more interested, didn't show as much interest as the others. Her head was preoccupied with different matters. With his eyes glued on Ren's figure on the stage, surprise flashed across Octavius's languid eyes. Given his strength, he was naturally able to see exactly what happened, and it was because he was able to see what happened that he was left surprised. Simply put, the speed of the attack was incredibly fast. So fast that even an S-ranked individual would have difficulty following up unless they paid close attention to it. Lowering his head, he glanced at his watch and sent a message. Send me information regarding the young man on the stage. Pressing onto the screen, he proceeded to send the message. Whoever he sent the message to, they were efficient. Within a minute or two he got a reply back. The moment his eyes landed on the information, the surprise in his eyes only increased. Name Rindover. Status. Dead. Information. Believed to have died during an explosion at the lock 3 years in the past, during the Inter-Academy tournament. Inheritor of the Keiki style. Reading through the information, Octavius momentarily closed his eyes. Nully, so this is who 876 is. Piecing all the information together, he quickly came to the conclusion that Rin was 876. As his thoughts paused there, his brows furrowed. Nully, why did he reveal himself? It wasn't really that hard for him to figure out that he was 876. Matching the exact time when the monolith said they met 876 to the time Rin supposedly died, Octavius did not think for a moment that 876, or should he say Rin, would do something so careless and reveal his identity so quickly. There was definitely more to it than he thought. Opening his eyes again, he directed his attention back towards the tournament. Or to be more precise, in the direction of where Rin was. The interest in his eyes only increased. He was curious about his motives for suddenly revealing himself. Rin slowly put the mask away. Nully swoosh. A soft breeze suddenly brushed past his body, sending his hair scattering all over his face. Raising his hands, Rin took out a hairband and tied his hair back. On the other hand, as Rin tied his hair, Keimer, who had slowly recuperated from the shock of what happened, grit his teeth and straightened his back once more. The languidness in his eyes completely disappeared, and what replaced it was a heavy solemnness. From that one brief exchange, Keimer understood that he was facing no easy opponent. In fact, it wasn't just him who understood this, as almost everyone that was spectating understood this. Whoever Caroleum was, he had previously been hiding his strength. Are you not going to start? Snapping Keimer out of his thoughts was Caroleum's cold voice. Raising his head and meeting Caroleum's dull gray eyes, Keimer's body faltered slightly. He took a step back. A deep sense of fear enshrouded his whole body as his eyes never left Caroleum's dull gray eyes. The more he looked at them, the more he felt his soul getting sucked into them. Reflected behind those dull gray eyes was the same figure standing in front of him. However, instead of standing in front of him, he was merely looking at him with a bored look, sitting on a golden throne. Most strikingly were his emotionless and cold eyes that seemed to treat him as a passerby, or rather an insignificant figure. It sent chills down his spine. The overbearing pressure coming from him became many times more powerful the more he stared at HM, as a deep sense of dread completely washed over his entire body. It felt as though he was in the presence of a monarch. A being that he was not supposed to cross. His legs buckled slightly. He suddenly had the urge to kneel. Oh, he had to kneel. How could someone like him remain standing in front of such a presence? But just as he was about to kneel, he suddenly stopped. Nully, what am I doing? He suddenly thought to himself. Was he just about to kneel? Who was he? He was Keimer, one of the strongest orcs amongst the younger generation and someone who had only kneeled in front of his leader, Brutus. How dare he suddenly kneel to some unknown human he had never met before? Preposterous. Closing his eyes, Keimer channeled all the aura inside of his body as he screamed at the top of his lungs. Huarg. As he screamed, his thunderous voice boomed throughout the whole arena as he quickly snapped out of his delusions. Clenching his teeth, the aura revolving around his body intensified to the extreme as he reached out to grab onto his axe, which was behind his back, using his left arm. The one that was not injured. Nelly sighing. Sparks flew on the ground as the tip of the axe came into contact with the ground. Then once he took out his axe, without wasting any time, he tensed his legs and propelled his body forward. This time as he moved, he made sure to increase his speed even further. His speed was even faster than in the first exchange. From the previous exchange, he understood that even though his opponent was not exactly strong, the speed at which he could attack was terrifying. Most frightening was his ability to make decisions in the little time he gave him to react. Therefore, after thinking things through, Keimer decided to switch strategies. Instead of opting for pure speed, he was planning on using brute force as well. Nully bang. Arriving before Caroleum, pressing his foot onto the ground till it cracked apart, Keimer raised his axe and cut horizontally. Fast and furious. The moment the axe came swinging down, it came charging in Ren's direction like an avalanche. Its momentum was almost unstoppable. My eyes stung. Staring at the incoming attack that seemed to be able to cut through me like butter using Eyes of Kronos, I found that the more I used the skill, the more my eyes started to hurt. His current attack was many times faster than his previous attack. The power that it contained was also many times stronger. Unfortunately, the attack was not something I could dodge. Therefore, after thinking things through, deactivating Eyes of Kronos, I pressed my foot onto the ground, tilted my body towards the direction of where the axe was coming from, and met the attack using the body of my sword. Nully clank. Sparks flew in every direction as his axe came into contact with my sword. For a brief moment, neither of our weapons moved, but this only lasted for a short moment before I found myself flung all the way towards the other side of the arena. Intense pain coursed throughout my whole body as my hands almost let go of the sword in my hand. Nully bang. Whilst I was in midair, I suddenly heard another loud sound coming from the direction of where Keimer was from. Lowering my head, I watched as Keimer stretched his waist and threw a brutal punch in my direction. What came after was a small after image of a fist that quickly shot in my direction. Staring at the incoming attack, I had very little time to react. Raising my sword and ignoring the pain, I channeled all the mana inside of my body and drew 2 rings. Once the rings formed, raising my hand, I directed one ring towards where the attack was coming from, whilst I directed the other one to go right beneath one of my feet as a form of foothold. But it appeared as though I had underestimated the power hidden behind Keimer's attack. Not even a second after coming into contact with the ring, it quickly tore it apart before arriving right in front of me. Kuok. This time I was not so lucky as my body once again shot back and I felt a lingering sweetness coming from the back of my throat. Spurt. Unable to hold back the sweetness, I spat a mouthful of blood as I felt my chest cave in slightly. I knew that I had broken at least 5 ribs. Nully bang. 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 But this was not it. Not even a second after I got hit by the first attack, I heard the sound of 5 more attacks headed my way. My face darkened at the thought. Suppressing the pain, motioning for my last ring to come my way, the ring quickly arrived beneath my foot. Touching the ring with my right foot, I released all the tension that I had been gathering in it and propelled my body upwards. Nully swoosh. Swoosh. Nully, doing so I was able to narrowly avoid the attacks. However, just because I was able to avoid the attacks didn't mean I could relax as Keimer continued to send more and more attacks my way. Nully bang. 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 Lowering my head and staring at the incoming attacks, I had a sudden thought. Nully, doesn't this remind me of Amanda's attacks? By now I was around 400 meters above the platform. Beneath me were a barrage of attacks that came hurtling in my direction like cannonballs. Subjected to such high intensity of attacks, I would have normally panicked by now, but this scenario 1632 was oddly familiar. Subjected to such high intensity of attacks, I would have normally panicked by now, but this scenario was oddly familiar. It looked exactly like the scenario which I practiced with Amanda many times in the past. Instantly, an idea on how to handle this came into my mind. Raising my sword and channeling all the mana inside of my body, I continuously drew circles in the air. As I drew the circles in the air, the pain that was coming from my chest intensified as I had trouble breathing. Cough, cough. I spat more blood. By now, my body, which had been rapidly raising, was slowing down, and it wouldn't be long before I would fall back down. Fortunately, that was exactly what I wanted. Upon drawing my 12th circle, the momentum was completely gone and my body quickly fell to the ground. Beneath me were the massive cannonball-like attacks. Blinking once, I muttered inside of my mind. Nully eyes of Kronos. Time slowed down and the whole world around me froze. With the aid of the chip inside of my head, my eyes dilated as an arrow suddenly appeared inside of my vision, showing me the path that I needed to take in order to make it back down to the ground safely. Everything happened within a small fraction of a second, and once I managed to find the right path, I quickly acted. Clenching both fists tightly, the rings around me quickly shot downward and positioned themselves in the spots where I had calculated the attacks wouldn't land. Then, pressing onto a ring that I had placed beneath my foot, I propelled my body downwards. Like an arrow, my body shot towards the nearest ring I had set up at unparalleled speed. Once I arrived next to it, I would use it as a foothold to push my body down even faster. Nully boom. Boom. Each time I stepped onto the ring, it would explode into millions of particles. However, thanks to this, I was able to increase my speed even more. I was traveling so fast that from time to time I was forced to activate Eyes of Kronos. This was so that I would not lose sight of what was happening around me. Nully boom. Boom. Breaking apart 2 more rings, activating Eyes of Kronos once again, I finally saw Chimer standing in the middle of the arena. It was only for a brief moment, but when I saw Chimer, I realized that he was holding onto his axe with both hands. His eyes locked in my direction. A cold chill ran down my spine as I placed my hand on the sheath of my sword. The third movement of the Keiki style. Void Step. Chapter 432. Your choice. 3. Click. It was very subtle, but almost everyone in the arena and the ones spectating were able to hear the sound. Zach and Lorena, who were staring at the screen, their eyes filled with shock, suddenly stood up as they watched Ren's figure disappear from the sky. He was already traveling at a speed that made it hard for them to follow, but the moment they heard the clicking sound, his figure, which was already a blur, completely disappeared from their vision. What followed his disappearance was a deathly silence as Ren's figure suddenly materialized in front of Chimer. It had to be noted that before his figure disappeared, he was still quite far from him. For him to have suddenly appeared in front of Chimer at such speed, many couldn't follow his movements. It was then that Ren's sword met with Chimer's axe. A loud metallic sound rang in the air, traveling through the ears of each person in the arena. With the tip of his sword meeting the edge of Chimer's axe, time seemed to stand still as everyone kept their eyes glued on the 2 figures standing in the middle of the arena. Boom. The originally quiet environment was soon drowned out by the terrifying sound of an explosion as 4 pressurized circular energy beams shot out from the point of contact between the 2 weapons. The whole arena started to crack apart as small pieces of rock flung in the air like projectiles. Unfortunately for Rin and Chimer, the projectiles quickly attacked them as even more wounds started to appear on their bodies. It wasn't long before Ren's upper garments tore off, revealing his muscular body that was riddled with scars. The sight was deeply etched into the vision of everyone that was watching. Soon enough, dust flew in the air, covering the vision of most spectators. The explosion was so loud and powerful that even after it disappeared, some people had difficulty hearing. Slowly, once the after effects of the explosion died down and the dust slowly started to settle, every spectator leaned forward with anticipation. Their palpitating heartbeats rang throughout their heads as they all had the same question inside of their mind. Who won? Just who had won between the 2 contestants? It wasn't long before everyone got their answer. Zach and Lorena simultaneously looked at the screen with extreme surprise. Displayed on their screen were the images of both Rin and Chimer laying down on the ground, blood seeping from the bodies of both individuals. Neither of them was moving. Zach and Lorena's heart squeezed the moment they saw this. Zach softly muttered in response. It looks like both contestants are knocked out cold. The match seems to be coming to end in a... However, just as he thought that the match was going to end in a draw, his eyes lit up as he watched both Ren and Chimer's body twitch. His eyes instantly lit up when he saw this. Ugh. Everything felt like a blur to me. I don't quite remember what happened after my strike, but all I could feel at the moment was an intense pain coursing down my body. Regaining a bit of clarity, I felt my cheek pressing against something hard. Oh. Opening my eyes, I realized that I was on the ground. Blood leaked from my mouth. Slowly lifting my head and glancing around, I could see all the spectators' eyes directed in my general direction. I couldn't quite hear anything. There was this constant ringing sound inside of my head that prevented me from hearing anything. The referee was also standing not so far away from where I was, carefully alternating his head in my direction and to somewhere behind me. Placing my right hand on the ground, an electrifying pain ran through my whole body, prompting me to fall back down on the ground. With both forearms on the ground, my eyes twitched repeatedly as my body seemed to refuse to listen to me. Eventually, through sheer grit of will, I supported my body up with the aid of my arm. The ringing sensation inside of my ears decreased, the noise coming from the arena becoming more discernible. Thunderous. It would be how I'd describe the audience once my ears returned to normal. The noise coming from the audience was thunderous. So loud that it reminded me of a thunderbolt descending from the sky. Drowning the noise coming from the crowd to the back of my mind, I grabbed onto the side of my waist and forcefully suppressed myself from screaming out in pain. Although I couldn't quite make out the extent of my injuries, from the way I was having a hard time moving and breathing, I could tell that I was severely injured. Even then, since the referee had still not announced the victor, I knew that I didn't win yet. Gritting my teeth hard, I slowly turned around, and it was then that I saw Keimer standing opposite me. His current state was the same as me, or rather he seemed to be in a worse state as his right arm hung loosely down his body. On his left was his axe. Blood dripped down from his body. With one eye closed, he glared in my direction and took a small step forward. Then, grabbing onto a small fruit from the side of his pants, he quickly put it in his mouth. Immediately, some of his superficial wounds started to heal. God damn it, this fucker is still standing. I cursed inside of my mind when I saw this. If I said that I was in a state to fight, then it would be a lie. At the moment, every time I tried to move my body, it would ache uncontrollably as all the muscles inside screamed in pain. Not only that, my mana was completely drained. I was no longer in a state to be able to use my sword anymore. However, if there was one thing that I could do, it was to withstand the pain. I may scream here and there because of the pain, but that was merely something I did to distract my brain. Taking a deep breath and tapping onto my bracelet, I took out a couple potions and quickly ingested them. Slowly, some of my injuries started to heal. Unfortunately, the effects of the potion weren't instantaneous and the extent of my injuries were just too much to heal in such a short period of time. Fortunately, it was enough to give me that one push to fight for a bit longer. Thump. Keimer took another step. Raising my head and clenching my fists, I similarly took a step forward. Thump. Thump. Slowly but surely we both neared each other. It wasn't long before we came face to face with one another. His towering figure looked down on me from above as I looked back at him straight into his eyes, neither one of us giving each other an inch. Here. I could feel Keimer's breathing from where I was. Thump. Suddenly, with a large sound, Keimer dropped the axe in his hand. Whoa arg. He suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs. His body arched backwards, his hand curling into a fist. A dark green glow enshrouded Keimer's fist. Seeing him prepare himself to attack, I decided to meet his attack head-on. Channeling all the mana inside my body, I also curled my hand into a fist. A powerful glow suddenly enshrouded my hand as I breathed out and glared at my opponent. Then, seemingly coming to an agreement, we both punched out. Bang! A powerful blasting sound reverberated throughout the whole arena the moment our fists connected. What followed after was a strong circular pressurized wind gale that shot outwardly, our clothes fluttering due to it. Caw! It wasn't long before our hands separated. A pained groan escaped from my lips as I felt my hand shatter apart upon meeting his fist. Keimer let out a similar sound as his body skid back a couple of meters. However, unlike me, his hand was still intact. Despite him being more injured than me, his body was tougher than mine. But that was the only thing I could do given my circumstances. Ignoring everything, I clenched my left fist and followed up with another punch. Only a second had passed from the previous attack. Wah-ag. Barely managing to react on time, Keimer raised his hand and blocked the attack using his forearm. Bang! Another powerful blast shot out as Keimer's figure skid back even more. A pained shout escaped from Keimer's mouth as his right leg gave out for a brief moment. Fall, damn it! I screamed in frustration as I glared at Keimer, who was still standing. Taking a step forward, my left leg similarly gave out, but I quickly moved my right leg and barely managed to stop myself from falling down. Placing my left hand on the ground, I hopped forward with my right leg and continued to move forward. Despite the fact that every part of my being wanted me to give up, I refused to listen. I had no choice but to do so. I couldn't lose. No, I didn't want to lose. So what if my opponent was stronger than me? Raising my head and staring at him who was barely holding on, I knew that this was the result of all the pain and suffering I had been going through. Giving up now was the same as trashing all of the experiences I went through. It wasn't long before I was once again front of Keimer. I clenched my right fist, the one that had shattered. Then rotating my heel and arching my body backward, I screamed. Stay the fuck down, damn it. Bang. Throwing a lower hook, my hand finally came into contact with Keimer's lower jaw. Whether I was able to deal significant damage to him or not, I couldn't tell as I lost complete control of my arm and I fell onto the ground. My right leg had finally given up. Thump. As I fell onto the ground, I felt a slight tremble coming from opposite me. Lifting my head, I saw Keimer's figure laying down on the ground with his eyes wide open, staring into the sky. Still not enough. A twisted anger suddenly rose from deep within me as I saw that Keimer had still not passed out. Using my left hand, the only hand I could move, I dragged my body forward. With every motion I made, an unprecedented amount of pain traveled throughout my body. But I just continued to endure. It wasn't long before I reached Keimer and mounted him from the top. My eyes soon met his. Raising my left hand and curling my fingers into a fist, I punched out. Bang. As I punched out, my hair came undone, scattering all over my face, but I didn't care. Raising my left hand again, I punched out once more. Give up, you piece of shit. Bang. Fucking faint already. Bang. Damn you. Each time I punched out, I cursed out loud to let go of my frustrations. At this point, I had long forgotten about my surroundings as I continued to punch and punch and punch. Bang bang. Just fucking give up. Swish. Huh. It was only after I felt a gentle power envelope me and lift me in the air Dee finally came to my senses. Soon I fell onto the ground with both knees. Lifting my head up and feeling the gazes of everyone present, my left hand finally lowered. The winner of this match is Liam. He will proceed to round of 16. The referee finally announced. Once the referee's words faded, a brief moment of silence ensued before the whole arena exploded into a fit of cheers. To be honest, I could barely make out what was happening. My vision was quite blurry. The only reason why I was still conscious was because I refused to pass out. Not when everyone is watching. Hiya. Raising my head, I gazed into the sky. This should be enough, no? Chapter 433, Your Choice, 4. Human Domain. A deathly silence enveloped the studios where Zach and Lorena worked at as neither of them could open their mouths. The scene that they had just witnessed, how could they describe it in words? It was so shocking that they were unable to say anything. It wasn't just them, but everyone who was watching felt the same. Especially the last few minutes of the match where they watched as Rin pummeled over Keimer's body, punching him until he completely passed out. Each and every one of his punches deeply resonated with their palpitating hearts, further imprinting the scene into their hearts. Dabu, what have we just seen? Zach softly mumbled as he slumped back down on his chair. His eyes filled with disbelief. He really couldn't understand what had just happened. At one moment he thought that it was going to be a one-sided beating, from then thinking that it was going to be a tie before finally ending in Ren's victory. The whole match was like a roller coaster of emotions for him and for everyone that was watching. It was simply mind-blowing. Could I have won if I was in the same position as him? Zach thought as he tried to recall the events of the match. No, it's impossible. He quickly shook his head. He didn't think so. Lifting his head, Zach stared straight into one of the cameras. For a good minute he didn't say anything. He just quietly stared at the cameras. Then opening his mouth he said, "He won." The moment those words left his mouth, the eyes of all the viewers watching returned to him. Lifting his papers and stacking them up, Zach took a deep breath before solemnly saying, "Rin Dover has defeated Keimer and has passed to the round of 16. Upper echelon platform. What an amusing fight. Gervas boisterously laughed out loud as he stood up and praised. Staring at the arena down below, his eyes shine with deep interest. Turning his head to look at Brutus, he couldn't help but throw a light jab in his direction. Who would have thought that your strongest warrior would be defeated at the hands of a human? You didn't see that one coming, right? Despite Gervas's taunts, Brutus's complexion remained the same as his heavy breathing resounded throughout the area. Here. With his eyes locked onto the arena, more specifically Keimer, he turned to look in Ren's direction before saying, "The human deserved to win. A loss is a loss and Keimer has lost." True. Gervas nodded his head. Although he had not interacted much with Brutus in the past, he had a good impression of Brutus. This was simply because of his honest personality. He wasn't the type of person that would hold grudges at a loss. This was just how he and the orcs were. They respected those that beat them without making any excuses. Taking his attention away from Brutus, Gervas softly mumbled to himself. That aside, the match was truly unexpected. I really didn't think that the human was this capable. Gervas meant those words. Although he knew that Rin was capable as he had seen firsthand his capabilities back in Henler, that was only on a mental aspect. He had actually never seen him fight, despite him having one of the largest merits in them being able to take down Inferno and stop the war. Gervas had not seen him fight once. And having just witnessed how Rin fought firsthand, he really was left impressed by his performance. Such talent. He really was envious. Snapping out of his thoughts, Gervas suddenly remembered something. Turning his head to look at where Octavius was sitting, for the first time ever since seeing him, Gervas finally saw a change in Octavius's facial expression. Although it was still indifferent, there was this deep sense of solemnity hiding deep within them. Massaging his beard, he decided to go to him. He had something he needed to say to him. Walking up to him, he stopped a couple of meters away from him and coughed. Hearing Gervas's cough, Octavius raised his head. "Do you need something?" Putting on an amicable smile, Gervas calmly sat down next to him. Turning his head and staring straight into his eyes, Gervas suddenly asked, "What did you think about the match?" A hint of surprise appeared on Octavius's face upon hearing Gervas's question. What came after it was wariness. It was good. Even then he still replied after a short pause. Gervas nodded his head upon hearing his words before leaning back on his chair. "I totally agree with you. The match was very good. Especially that human youth over there that won. He's quite the talent, isn't he?" "He is," Octavius replied. Gervas nodded his head more fiercely when he heard his words. Right. He is also very smart and will probably be one of the future pillars of the human side if I'm not wrong." "What are you trying to get at?" Octavius coldly asked, his brows finally furrowing together and the air around him finally changing. He had finally realized that the situation was not right. For what reason was he trying to praise Ren? Was it truly an innocent act, or was he trying to imply something else? It didn't take long for Octavius to get an answer as Gervas calmly and slowly said. Walking over the edge of the platform, he transmitted his voice inside of Octavius's head. "You see, you may not know this, but that human over there helped me out quite a bit over the last year, and it would truly be a bummer if something happened to him." Upon hearing Gervas's words, everything started to click inside Octavius's head. He had already received the reports of what had happened back in Henler from Douglas and the vice leader. He had a general idea of what happened and how they were able to defeat Inferno and stop the war. The moment he heard Gervas's words, putting the pieces together, Octavius understood just what his words implied. Once he did, Octavius's eyes chilled. "Are you threatening me?" "Am I threatening you?" Walking back to his previous chair, Gervas sat back down, leaned back and massaged his beard. This behavior persisted for a good minute before eventually he shook his head. "No, I am not threatening you. I'm just telling you how the facts are." Turning his head to face Ren's direction, he continued. "You need to realize that this whole conference would not have happened if not for his aid. It wouldn't be wise if something happened to him." Standing up, Gervas took one last glance in Octavius's direction before leaving. "He's waiting for you. You should go meet him. I'll be visiting him in the next hour. I sure hope he is still breathing when I visit him next." As he left, his words directly entered Octavius's mind, causing his frown to tighten. Crack. A cracking sound suddenly resounded as the Octavius gripped onto the side of the chair with increased intensity. Beneath the arena, Ha! Amidst the thunderous crowd, Amanda was sitting on a small bench collecting her breath. Despite it soon being her turn, Amanda refused to go to the arena. The reason for this was because of Ren's match. The moment the match started, she couldn't take her eyes away from his figure. The intensity at which he fought, the way he skillfully dealt with his opponent's moves, and the way he completely disregarded his own safety just to secure his own victory, Amanda's emotions were in a state of disarray. Her current feelings were hard to describe. On one hand, she could see just how much he had improved over the years when he went missing. She had already seen a glimpse of his strength during the time she reunited with him, but it was only now that she fully understood the extent of his improvement. The pain and suffering that he must have gone through in order to achieve such a level of strength, Amanda couldn't imagine, nor did she want to imagine. Every time she did, an uncomfortable feeling would rise from deep within her heart. She couldn't really explain what that feeling was. But she didn't like it. On the other hand, the stronger he became, the further he felt from her. He hated that feeling. Secretly, she was quite a competitive person, and so, as she watched Ren and the others drastically improve, a never-seen-before fire lit up inside of her heart, prompting her to want to train even harder. "Amanda Stern, please make your way to the portal." Snapping her out of it, Amanda's wrist suddenly lit up as a melodious voice reached her ears. She stood up and looked down in the stands. Below, she could faintly see the outline of an elf standing next to a portal. 09. Taking one last look in the direction of Ren's match, Amanda bit her soft cherry-colored lips before slowly making her way down towards the portal. It wasn't long before she reached the portal. Raising her hand and presenting her wrist, the elf took a step to the side. "You may go in." Nodding her head, Amanda closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then, recalling Ren's fight, from the way he fought to the way he persevered throughout the end despite being at a clear disadvantage, she tightened the grip of her bow and stepped forward. "I see, so this is the gap between us." With his eyes locked onto the projection where Ren stood in the middle, Jean slowly closed his eyes. He originally thought that he had managed to bridge the gap between the two of them, but it soon became clear to him that it was merely his delusions. The fight just now had clearly shown him the difference between himself and Ren. It wasn't just that he was stronger, but the way he was quickly able to adjust to the situation and come up with solutions in that short period of time he was fighting, that truly shocked Jean. One notable example of this was during this fight. During the last moments of their exchange. Not many may have realized this, but the moment Ren was about to attack, he realized that Keimer was also preparing to unleash a terrifying attack. Whilst in the air and before activating whatever last skill he used, Keimer's axe was already swinging down on him. In that split moment of time when Keimer's axe came down, Ren directly aimed the tip of his sword right at his axe. The intent behind it was clear. Disrupt the attack before it could gather even more energy. In fact, now that Jean thought about it, this was probably the only move he could pull considering his position. Had he directly aimed for Keimer, although he may have perhaps been able to defeat him, he would have probably sustained injuries far more grievous than what he ended up with. Jean might even push it as far as saying that he could have died. Simply put, Ren far outstripped him in terms of experience. An aspect that Jean severely lacked in comparison to him. "I won't give up." Even then, Jean suddenly clenched his fists. Despite having come to the realization that the gap between the two was big, Jean still chose not to give up. Like his father said, "The moment one is satisfied with themselves, that is the moment their growth will stunt." And he firmly believed this. Sitting up on my bed with bandages all over my arms, I calmly looked towards the outside of the window. Behind it were the beautiful landscapes of Isanor. 8 broken ribs, a fractured hand, shattered right hand, broken kneecap and a concussion. Those were the extent of my injuries. If not for the fact that the elves had cast on me multiple spells and I was given a couple of potions, I would have long passed out from the pain. I took a deep breath as a calm silence enshrouded the room. The atmosphere unfortunately was soon broken by the presence of someone. It was so subtle and unnoticeable that the only reason why I was able to tell that someone had appeared was through the small reflection of the window glass. Even then I was not panicked. Closing my eyes, I softly said, "You've come. So you're the famous 876. A cold and emotionless voice responded back. Slowly turning my head away from the window, my eyes met with Octavius Hall's, the #1 ranked hero in the human domain. Lowering my head, I politely replied, In the Flesh. Chapter 434 Your Choice, 5. Upon confirming that I was indeed 876, the very air in the room chilled by a few degrees. When I felt this, I merely smiled. There was not an ounce of nervousness inside of my body. Octavius Hall was a pragmatic man. He was someone who calculated profits above all else. Although he didn't look like it from where I sat, I could tell that he was fuming. If there was one thing that Octavius hated, it was losing control. In a way, he was like me, except that he sought a different type of control. He sought control for the sake of his minuscule pride, while I sought control for the sake of being able to quickly adjust over the slightest of changes. Even then, seeing his current complexion, I couldn't help but think to myself, guess Gervis overdid it. There could only be one reason I could think of for him to be like this, and that was because he had been threatened by Gervis. Well, it was inevitable. I had to guarantee my own life after all. Does your confidence stem from Gervis's backing? Octavius finally spoke, his cold voice reverberating throughout the whole room. I tilted my head for a second before eventually nodding. In a way, yes. So you're not afraid I will ignore his warning and kill you right here on the spot? Yup, not at all. I shook my head. Then, glancing at him from the corner of my eyes, I softly added, to be honest, I fear Melissa more than you. This was not a joke. As I've said before, Octavius was a pragmatic man. He wasn't the type to act rashly. Since Gervis had obviously threatened him, it was clear that he couldn't make any rash moves, and as such I wasn't worried about my safety. But unlike him, Melissa would attack me even if she was threatened. There was a clear difference between the two. I see. Octavius nodded. Surprisingly, he didn't look too fazed by the fact that I mentioned his daughter. Did he perhaps already figure out that I was the one working with her regarding the magic cards? If so, things were going to be even easier than I thought. After a brief moment of silence, he opened his mouth again. His voice sounded much calmer than before. Your goal is freedom, isn't it? My brows knit. Yes. At my confirmation, Octavius quickly followed up with another question. And you're trying to frame Aaron as 876 in order to gain freedom, correct? Right. It was pretty much the gist of it, yes. Guess he had fully understood what I was planning. However, his next words caused the frown on my face to deepen. What about your family? Don't worry about them. I coldly replied. However, it seemed as though it went to deaf ears as Octavius continued. By now, I'm sure that it is not just I who figured out that you're 876. The monolith must have found out as well. Since they can't come here, in all likelihood they are going to target your parents. Was this the freedom that you wanted? Closing my eyes, I calmly looked back towards the scenery of Isanor. They won't do shit, I replied after a while. A smile soon crept up on my face. Do you believe I didn't think this far ahead? I wasn't that naive to think that he would be the only one to figure things out. From the very beginning, I knew that the monolith would find out about my identity the moment I revealed my face. I had already made preparations a long time ago. At the moment they should be in safe hands. Turning my attention back towards Octavius, I lazily said, my family is safe, and they won't have any trouble with you or Monolith. To my surprise, instead of displaying anger, Octavius merely closed his eyes and nodded. So you've thought things through. Opening his eyes once again, he leaned back on his chair. If you've thought that far, then I have no choice but to listen to what you have to say. Octavius interlocked his fingers. So tell me, why should the Union help you? Why should you help me? My eyes opened wide before I eventually laughed. Turning to look at Octavius, I looked around the room before I pointed toward myself. Are you messing with me? I need your help. Did he smoke something before coming here? When in the world did I ever say that I needed their help? Did they actually think that I would seek help from the one organization that turned its back on me? How laughable. Lifting my head up, I stared straight into Octavius's eyes. The smile on my face completely disappeared as I leaned in closer. Listen well and listen good. Let's make something clear. I never needed your help, nor do I need it now. All I'm doing right now is giving you a choice. It seemed as though he had completely misunderstood the situation. I didn't ask him to come to me for my sake, no, it was for their sake. Lowering my hand and shifting my body forward a little, I asked, I'm sure by now you've seen my worth, have you not? Octavius didn't answer. I continued. You've seen my fight, have you not? You've also seen that I'm on good terms with the dwarves, and not only that, I've saved the asses of some of your precious people a while back. The more I spoke, the sharper my words became. I was simply venting out my frustrations. Not only did I see Monica and the others back at the monolith, but I also had many other qualities that should prove my worth. Lowering my head and gazing at my watch, I tapped on the screen and a holographic image appeared before us. Presented in the holographic image was a replica of the contract Octavius and the others had signed with the monolith. Once I took out the contract, Octavius's face finally changed a little. His voice turned deep and he asked, "Where did you get a copy of that?" "You probably already know," I replied. The answer was obvious anyways. It was from Waylon. I had already briefed him on my situation with the Union, so he knew of my circumstances. The moment we arrived in Isanor as the vice leader of the Union, he helped me get a copy of the contract. It was only after reading through it that I was able to find the holes within it. Regarding Waylon, things would have been easier if he was here, but he headed back to the human domain the moment he got rid of Jasper. He had to sort out his house after all. Concerning the contract, it was just a copy and not the real thing, but it was enough. "Have a look over here." Raising my hand, I pointed toward two highlighted parts in the contract. The terms of the contract will be null if Party A Union fails to provide adequate effort in the capture of wanted fugitive 876, dead or alive. I slowly recited before pointing toward another section of the contract. Because Party A does not have the means to properly identify 876, Party B will provide Party A with a tracking system as well as a blood measuring system that will verify the identity of the captive. If the two criteria are met, Party A is requested to bring the individual to Party B. Pausing, I raised my head and looked at Octavius. I wonder what these two things could be. You know, the tracking system and blood measuring system. I proceeded to cross my arms before sarcastically saying, maybe the device that was found in Aaron's head, or even possibly the traces of serum found inside of his body? In response to my question, Octavius merely closed his eyes and continued to not say anything. I shrugged it off. Party B will provide Party A with a tracking system as well as a blood measuring system that will verify the identity of the captive. These words in the contract were what made me act the way I did back then when I attacked Aaron. I wasn't just venting out my emotions on that day. Even though a part of the reason was because of that, it wasn't the main reason why. No, I had taken that time to implant a chip inside of his head as well as inject a dosage of the serum into his body in order to meet the criteria that the monolith had set for when capturing 876, or to be more precise, me. The reason why the criteria was set as such was because the monolith feared that the Union would just send over a dummy and say that he was 876. They had to be more specific with their demands, hence why they set those two criteria. After all, the monolith was sure that the Union couldn't replicate the serum as well as the chip. They had every reason to believe that the criteria was enough, but unfortunately for them, they had not taken into account that Ryan was able to replicate the chip inside of my head and that I still had a couple of dosages of the serum on me. Furthermore, the contract was signed before I even went to the Dwarven domain, which was about to go to war at that time. Never in their wildest expectations did they believe that I would be able to gain their favor and create a small replica of the chip. If in any way Party A tries to tamper with the evidence, the contract will nullify and Party A will suffer heavy penalties. Tapping onto the screen of my watch, the hologram disappeared. I'm not part of the Union, so the contract terms have still not been breached, I stated. Furthermore, since the contract has not been breached, once I hand Aaron over to them, the truce will still last and the monolith won't be able to do anything, Octavius said as he cut my words off. Right. I nodded, not the least bit offended by the fact that he had cut me off. That was pretty much the gist of the plan. Although yes, the monolith would know that the one they were handing over was not the real 876, but because he met all of the criteria they had set up, they could only swallow the bitter pill. Added with the fact that the contract wouldn't breach when doing this, not only did I have to not worry about the monolith for a couple of years as they were still in a truce where they couldn't attack the human domain, the same would apply to the Union if they chose to support me. Staring into Octavius's eyes and seeing a trace of clarity within them, I understood that he was weighing down his options. Well, as if he has any. He had no choice but to agree with my terms. The only thing he could hold against me was the fact that one of the biggest diamond-graded guilds would hold a grudge against the Union if they choose to hand Aaron over, but it had to be noted that Kevin was the one who killed Aaron. And where did Kevin belong to? That's right, the Union. This meant that they had already offended the diamond-graded guild. Furthermore, considering Kevin's talent and Octavius's pragmatic way of thinking, there was no way he was going to hand him over to them. The bridge between the Union and Aaron's guild had long been burned down. This meant only one thing. He had no choice but to choose me. There was no other alternative, and he understood that. I'm sure he did. This became notable to me from how silent he was being. Checkmate. Leaning back on the bed, I once again gazed into the distance. All the threads I had set up had finally closed down, trapping Octavius completely. Unless he was demented, he had no choice but to say yes. So what are you going to do? I eventually asked. Chapter 435, About My Mother. 1. Letting out a long breath, my eyes stayed fixed on the scenery presented outside of the window glass. The scenery outside was dotted with beautiful green grass, great mountains, and ancient trees that further added to the vibrancy of the place. It gave me a sense of tranquility that I desperately needed, especially after going through such a big fight. The silence continued to persist as I slowly lost myself to the scenery outside. Alone, silently gazing in the distance with no one to bother me. It felt soothing. After asking Octavius about the choice he was going to make, he just simply left. Vanished out of thin air. I took that as a sign of confirmation. He may have not explicitly said yes, but had the answer been no, I would have surely been able to tell. Either way, I cared more about actions rather than verbal agreements. He could tell me yes right now, but that solved nothing. Only through handing over Aaron would I truly know the answer to his decision. Lifting my head to gaze at the fluffy white clouds roaming in the sky, I pressed my hand against the window before mumbling softly. If Octavius truly does agree, I'll finally be able to go back home, huh? Those words. They felt quite weird. After who knew how long, finally I was soon going to be able to return home. Not as 876, nor anyone else, but as myself, Rundover. The sense of relief when I realized this was immeasurable as my shoulders finally relaxed and the anxiety within me subsided. I was finally going to come back home. Click. Snapping me out of my thoughts, I suddenly heard the sound of the door opening. Glancing in that direction, my brow raised in surprise. Oh my, you're actually coming to visit me? Unfortunately for me, the person who I spoke to didn't answer back as she just calmly entered the room. The person who had just entered was none other than Angelica, who curiously looked around the place. Seeing her like that, my brows furrowed. You not going to say anything? Did she just come here to sightsee? From the looks of it, it really did look like that. Raising her head, Angelica softly said. I was bored. Her words were so unexpected that I had no idea how to reply to her. In fact, I really didn't know how to reply. You're bored. You can't hear human? No, I can. But what does that have to do with anything? You know what, never mind. Before she could say anything else, I quickly cut her off. I just recalled the fact that the others had left the human domain, and that she was trapped in a room for a major part of the week. Since she wasn't adept with technology, the only thing she could do during those weeks was training, and while that was boring, I only realized now just how bored she must have been. Once my thoughts paused there, I felt a little bit guilty as I took out my tablet from my dimensional space and pressed on the screen. A holographic image soon appeared. Then, pointing towards the seat where Octavius previously sat, I nudged with my head. Since you've got nothing to do, come watch the matches with me. It might help relieve your boredom. Okay. Angelica nodded her head after a bit of hesitation. From the struggle in her eyes, I could tell that she wasn't too keen on watching since her strength was far above theirs. But in the end she still decided to watch. Guess she was that bored. Only 10 minutes had passed since the previous match where Rin defeated Keimer, and the crowd was still excitedly discussing the events of what happened before. The previous match was so thrilling that all other matches seemed a lot more lackluster. That was until the current match started. Ping. A cold blade cut through the air as Jin's figure suddenly appeared behind a towering figure. An extremely intense energy ripple suddenly erupted from his body. Just as Jin's blade was about to slice through the neck of his opponent, a thin veil suddenly materialized around the figure, blocking his attack as a loud metallic sound reverberated through the air. Not enough. Upon seeing his attack missing, Jin knit his brows for a moment. He suddenly twisted his body in midair before quietly landing on the surface of the arena. Upon landing on the ground, Jin raised his head and stared at his opponent, who was similarly staring back at him. Artian. That was the name of Jin's opponent. According to the information Ren had given him, he was Khymer's right-hand man, and although he was quite a bit weaker, he was still an extremely powerful individual. A raging fire burned inside of Jin's eyes as he looked at his opponent. Artian may have been weaker than Khymer, but he was still a strong opponent. From what he heard, the way he fought was similar to Khymer. Jin may have been able to see the difference between himself and Ren, but only through a real fight would he be able to feel the true difference between them. And that was why he was particularly excited about his match. Huarg. With a loud shout, a majestic green glow made out of aura erupted from Arshan's body as his muscles bulged outwardly. He was clearly trying to gather aura around his body to unleash a powerful strike. Not that Jin would let him. Pressing his right foot onto the ground, black threads suddenly started to materialize around Jin as his figure disappeared and reappeared a short distance in front of Artian. Humph. Spotting Jin, Artian let out a short snort. After which he curled his fingers into a fist and punched out. What followed his punch was a sonic boom that tore the air apart and headed in Jin's direction like an unstoppable train. Facing such a terrifying attack, Jin remained unfazed. Suddenly, to the shock of all viewers present, he closed his eyes. A small black pool suddenly formed beneath his feet as black threads shot out from the ground before wrapping around his body like a cocoon. It wasn't long before his figure was completely enveloped by the black threads. All of this happened within a short second, and the moment the attack was about to land on him, opening his eyes, revealing his emerald green eyes, Jin's figure suddenly disappeared from the spot, avoiding Arshan's attack by a hairbreadth. Boom. Despite Jin's absence, Arshan's attack continued to pass through the platform before reaching the edge of the arena, releasing a thunderous sound. Watching his attack miss, Arshan's expression turned extremely solemn. With his eyes darting all over the arena, he focused all of his attention on his senses as he tried to pick up any clue regarding Jin's whereabouts. Bang! Sensing something raising his foot, Artian suddenly stomped his foot on the ground. With a loud bang, the ground beneath him cracked apart and a shadow jumped out. The moment the shadow appeared, Arshan's sharp gaze locked onto it and he punched in that direction, but... Ting! Artian suddenly felt a cold chill run down his back as another shadow materialized behind him. It was at that moment he realized that he had been tricked. The previous attack was a decoy. Ha! Crying out loud, Artian channeled all the aura inside of his body. A soft glow enveloped his whole body as the muscles of his body expanded even more. Forcefully twisting his body, his eyes became bloodshot and he changed the direction of his fist towards where the shadow came from. As he changed the course of his attack, he could feel his muscles scream in agony. But he still persisted and punched out. Boom! His fist tore through the air, resulting in a powerful blast to resound throughout the platform. But just as he thought he had managed to counter his opponent, he realized that his attack had missed. Ting! Yet again, Artian suddenly felt a dangerous feeling rising from behind him. Gritting his teeth, his face twisted savagely as he shouted. "Stop hiding, you rat!" His voice was so powerful that even the audience below could hear it. However, none of them paid attention to Artian as everyone's eyes were locked on a figure standing on the opposite end of the arena. With his right hand raised and half of his hand covered in black, everyone watched as black threads encircled Jin's arm. His cold eyes were currently locked onto Artian, who was currently madly throwing punches around. Failing to realize that beneath him was a small black pool that would shoot black threads left and right whenever Jin's hand twitched. Slowly but surely more and more black threads formed from beneath the pool, wrapping around Arshan's legs. Because he was so distracted by the attacks, Artian was unable to take note of the black threads, and before long about half of his lower body was covered in black threads. Huh. Finally, after realizing that something was wrong with the situation, Artian lowered his head and took notice of the black threads. Out of pure instinct, the first thing he did was lower his arm and grab onto the threads. But as he pulled, he found that they were stuck onto him like rubber. He could still move properly, but something about the situation wasn't right. It was then that he raised his head and finally noticed Jin staring at him from the distance. Anger suddenly rose from deep within Artian as he pressed his foot on the ground, preparing to lunge in his direction. But just as he was about to move, Jin suddenly clenched his fist and the black threads around his tightened up considerably, halting his movement. Warg. Clenching his teeth, a green glow sprung out from Arshan's body as he forcefully tried to move his body. Thep, thep, thep. His efforts weren't in vain as soft snapping sounds rang out as some of the threads snapped off, allowing him to recover some of his mobility, but by the time he was able to take a step forward, it was too late. Ying. Appearing right in front of him was Jean. With his body twisted and his dagger near his right cheek, Artian eyes opened wide. Before he could react, Jean slashed down and a feeling of death suddenly washed over Arshan's body. Even then, as a proud orc, he kept his eyes open and continued to glare at the dagger. He knew from the moment that his body had been trapped that he had lost the match, but he still persisted. Unfortunately, his stare wasn't enough and Jin's dagger enlarged in front of him. Just as the dagger was about to take his life away, it came to a sudden halt. Thud. With a low thud, Jin landed on the ground and brushed his hair up. A deathly silence enveloped the arena grounds as all the spectators gazed in Jin's direction. However, the silence was soon broken by the referee's voice as it boomed throughout the whole venue. Winner of this round, Jean Horton, he will pass to the round of 16. Following the referee's words, the whole stadium erupted into cheers. Once Jin's match ended, it was Amanda's turn to compete. Standing on the opposite end of the arena, Amanda held onto her bow with her left hand while simultaneously taunting the string back with her left hand. A blue translucent arrow materialized on her bow as she gazed at her opponent. Standing opposite her was a young dwarven girl with both of her hair tied in ponytails. With both of her hands forward, grasping a metal bar, Amanda's face twitched slightly as she looked at the artifact the dwarven girl was holding. A submachine gun? Amanda really couldn't quite get a grasp on her opponent's weapon. However, she could tell from a single glance that it was no ordinary weapon. Materializing in the middle of the arena was the referee, who looked at both of them before asking, "Are the both of you ready?" Upon hearing the referee's words, Amanda and her opponent simultaneously nodded their heads. Without wasting any time, the referee officiated the match. Begin. Chapter 436, About My Mother. 2. Begin. The referee's voice boomed throughout the arena as mana simultaneously burst from both Amanda and her opponent. With both of her hands on the handle of the submachine gun-like artifact, a subtle red glow suddenly enshrouded the artifact as the tip slowly started to rotate. With each rotation, the faster the barrel moved. Eventually, after the first rotation, a small energy beam suddenly shot out from the barrel of the weapon as slowly but surely more and more energy beams started to shoot out. It wasn't before long that 3 more energy beams shot out. Amanda wasn't standing still while this was happening. With her back arched a little bit, she taunted the string of her bow back as 3 translucent blue arrows materialized on her bow. The moment the first energy beam shot out, Amanda calmly stood still. Her decision proved to be the correct one as the projectile quickly missed her, resulting in her hair to flutter wildly. Following the first beam, more and more beams started to shoot out from her opponent's artifact. Even then, Amanda refused to release her arrows. The mana around her started to twist. Whenever a beam would come hurtling towards her, she would either take a step to the side or move a small part of the body. Her movements were minimal, however, each time she moved she was able to miraculously dodge the energy beam that was hurtling towards her at incredible speed. Amanda's actions caused almost everyone that was watching to look at her in awe as her mesmerizing figure stood in the middle of the arena like an unbeatable war goddess. Her nimble and yet minimal movements that helped her dodge the beams caused everyone to be at a loss for breath. So skillful, everyone thought as they watched her dance around her spot, like a beautiful butterfly. The reason why Amanda was able to do all of this was because of her skill. Mana sense. A skill that essentially allowed her to sense the mana as well as see the disturbances around it. Not only did the skill help her determine the direction of her arrows when she shot them, but she was also able to sense the direction of where the attack of her opponent would go. It was thanks to this skill that she was able to do what she was doing. However, this only worked for a short period of time. From a certain point, the projectiles would become way too fast to dodge even if she knew where they were coming from. But fortunately, Amanda was ready. Barely dodging 3 more energy beams, the mana around Amanda's body burst out like a raging storm. Then, eyeing her opponent, she released 2 of the 3 arrows. Shoo. The moment she released the 2 arrows, the air tore apart and the 2 arrows disappeared from the spot. They were so fast that by the time Amanda's opponent could retaliate, they were already upon her. Letting out a low cry, a transparent shield suddenly materialized around the dwarven girl. However, what happened next was completely out of her expectations. Right as the arrows reached her, instead of hitting her shield as she expected them to, they suddenly expanded and formed two thin blue barriers, trapping her from above. In the distance, pursing her lips, Amanda softly muttered, "Contract." Instantly the two thin shields started to contract. And slowly but surely they reached the dwarven girl's shield, applying heavy pressure on it. Prick, prick, prick. It wasn't long before cracks started to appear on the shield of Amanda's opponent as a helpless look appeared on her face. Raising her bow towards the air, Amanda finally let go of the final arrow. Once again, it disappeared from her bow, tearing through the air like a comet. Crush. The exact moment her arrow left her bow, the barrier around Amanda's opponent finally tore apart with a loud crash. Before her opponent could even react, the dwarven girl suddenly felt a powerful mana fluctuation coming from above. Lifting her head up, she watched as a terrifying arrow came hurtling down on her. It was so fast that she was unable to react on time. Boom! A terrifying explosion ensued a couple of seconds after as Amanda's arrow came crashing down on her opponent, sending dust flying everywhere. Once the dust settled, everyone watched as the referee appeared a couple of meters in front of Amanda's opponent with his hand raised. Behind him was the frightened opponent who couldn't stop trembling as she let go of her large weapon. The winner of this match is Amanda Stern. She will pass to the round of 16. How strong? I softly said as I watched every second of Amanda's match. If I said I wasn't impressed by her performance, that would have been a lie. Although her opponent wasn't exactly the strongest, for Amanda to one-sidedly beat her like that was a testament to just how much she had improved over the years. Taking my eyes away from the screen, I turned to glance at Angelica. With her head cocked to the side and a curious look on her face, Angelica also seemed to be entranced by Amanda's performance. I smirked when I saw this. "By the way, did you really come here because you were bored?" Honestly, I had a hard time believing this. Although yes, she had been isolated alone, given her resources and the fact that she wasn't a very social person, I was kind of doubting her answer. Perhaps I was overthinking. Brushing her hair behind her ear, Angelica slowly raised her head and looked at me. After a while she shook her head. No. Oh. So there really was something else that she wanted to talk about. Now I was curious. Before I could say anything else, turning her attention back towards the screen, she softly said, "Silic has broken through rank and is planning on consolidating his strength before attacking both the Orc Chief and Marcus-ranked demon." Her words rang like thunderbolts inside of my head as I started recalling all of the plans that I had set up in the past. One of the plans was to turn Silic into the Orc Chief of Amora so that I could use him to help me fight against the Demon King who arrived during the Third Cataclysm. I see, that's great news. Although I was happy I didn't show too much of it. Silic had only broken through, he had done none of the things that I had tasked him to do. Not only was I unaware of where his true loyalties were, but I also sure hoped that he wouldn't die. After all, he was planning on interfering in the war between two individuals whose strength wasn't inferior to his. The only thing he had on them was the element of surprise, and even with that I knew that his chances of winning were not very high. They weren't low but not high at the same time. Did he say anything about the time he will attack? No. Angelica shook her head. Pausing for a second she added, "But I don't think he will attack any time soon. He is trying to find the best way to deal with the situation." I see. I thoughtfully nodded her head. A part of me was glad that Silic was not rushing into the big fight as soon as his strength broke through. However, my worries weren't the least bit quelled. After all, his death would put Angelica in jeopardy. I didn't want that to happen. Placing my hand on my chin and taking a small glance in Angelica's direction, I softly said, "You should probably turn yourself into a cat." Angelica's brows knit when she heard my words. "Why?" "That's because people will come to visit me soon. I'm sure you don't want too much attention, Gath." Before my words could even fade, we suddenly heard the sound of footsteps coming from the other side of the door. Opening up her eyes, throwing me a glare, a black shadow cast over Angelica before her figure shrunk and she turned into a cat. Following her transformation, she jumped up on the bed before resting on the top of the small ledge by the side of the window. Because she was now a full-fledged count-ranked demon, it only took a brief moment for her to transform. Just as she sat on the ledge, the door swung open and Kevin entered the room. Upon entering the room, Kevin causally greeted me. Hey, I'm King. I greeted back with a nod. Looking around the place, Kevin's feet suddenly came to a halt as he pointed in the direction of where Angelica was. His brows jumped up in surprise. Is that? Yes, it's her. I nodded my head. I had already briefed him about Angelica, so it was no surprise that he was able to recognize her. Raising my head, I asked, "Did you just come back from visiting Emma?" Yeah. Kevin replied as he sat down on the chair where Octavius and Angelica previously sat. Her condition seemed to have stabilized, however. She's still in a coma and hasn't woken up yet. I've heard. Emma's situation was, how should I say, delicate? After all, I was somewhat responsible for what happened. Or rather, the entity that was inside of me was responsible, but deep inside I knew that was also to blame. Had I realized that I was being controlled sooner, such things would have never happened. This was especially so after realizing that there were plenty of flags indicating to me that something wasn't right. Emma aside, have you seen her father? Kevin's next words caused me to snap out of my own thoughts. Raising my head, I looked up for a moment before nodding my head. Yes, he's back in the human domain. Family problems. Kevin's brows knit as soon as he heard my words. Does he know about Emma's situation? He probably doesn't. I shook my head. Because people couldn't communicate through the two places, Waylon probably had still not found out about the situation with Emma. It also had to be noted that her match had not been broadcasted live, meaning that even if he paid attention to the tournament he would have no idea. Seeing how troubled Kevin looked, I reassured him. Don't worry, I did send a couple of people to inform him. But I'm not sure when he will get the message. Those two individuals were Ava and Hein, who were both out of the competition. Since they probably both missed their families a lot, I told them to just go back to the human domain and visit their parents. On the way, I did remind them to tell Waylon about the situation with Emma. It wouldn't feel right if he didn't know. That's good. Visible relief appeared on Kevin's face as soon as he heard my words. Then, placing his hands on his knees, he slowly stood up. I just came to check up on you. Since you're fine, I'll take my leave. Throwing one last glance at Angelica, he turned around and headed for the door. Before leaving, halting his steps, he softly said, I saw your match with Keimer. My brow raised when I heard his words. What did you think of it? I lazily replied with my back leaning on the comfortable pillow of the bed. It took a while for Kevin to answer, but his next words surprised me a bit. Let's just say that I'm not confident in my chances of beating you. Before I could say anything else, opening the door, Kevin left the room, leaving me in my room staring in the direction of where he left with eyes wide open. Did he just say what I think he just said? I couldn't quite contain my surprise. Not many knew this, but Kevin was in fact extremely prideful. He may hide it well, but it was deeply engraved in his body. For him to suddenly say something like this only meant one thing. He truly meant those words. Honestly, I didn't know whether to be happy or sad. Echi. In the end, letting out a tired sigh, I turned my head to once again stare at the scenery outside. Although what Kevin said may have been true at the end of the day, those were just words. Only when we fought each other for real would we truly know who was stronger between the two of us. After a while, as I was gazing at the scenery with Angelica, the door once again opened. Turning my head to see who the person was, I was pleasantly surprised to find Amanda walking in. A smile appeared on my face. I saw your match, congratulations.